that was pretty disappointing. So I do scan these articles and read it before I make these, but I guess I didn't scan or read that one. Seriously, how embarrassing. All right. So I think when it comes to my rhetoric of the right's great reset, this is actually what is being triggered and the anger that's triggering the right's great reset. And this might be obvious because we've heard this all before. Jane Elliott went over this when talking about the birth dearth. Um, and this is something, even though this is inevitably happening, at least in terms of how apparently as America is dealing with it, it the left and people abroad should still fight this in their own countries because it's not all white supremacy in all countries. It's just fascism in general that has taken over. Anyways, abortion bans expose white anxiety about the reproduction of people of color in America again. Alright. The recent state of anti abortion legislation is rooted in white extinction anxiety and carries on a long tradition of white people controlling the lives and reproduction of people of color. Um, this article is from 2019, by the way, but in terms of just like a historical overview on this type of topic, I don't think it's I don't think it's that strange in terms of how unchronological this has been. All right. Last year, white people constituted 60% of the U.S. Constitution, down from about 90 in 1950. It's projected that by 2050, they will be the new minority and people of color will be the majority. A nightmarish prediction to some white people. Senator Lindsey Graham voiced his concern of a demographic delusion at the 2012 Republican convention when he said, quote, "The demographics race we're losing badly. Republicans are not generally enough angry white guys to stay in business for a long term." What the heck? Graham's comments relay what social scientists and anti-racist activists call white extinction anxiety, or, quote, fear of white genetic annihilation. The idea that white people would go the way of the dinosaurs has been dismissed by some simply pity of personal circumstances or conspiracy theory. But the convergence effect of new laws banning abortion together with old laws promoting mass incarceration of black and brown people suggests that this white fear is not just an idea, but the catalyst for public policy. Hey, I was just actually saying that it feels like reproductive policy has been like entrenched in the way we've been guided into how we do things. Not always, but it does feel like that sometimes. Anyways, there indeed appears to be a strong correlation between demographic projections and fear of white genetic annihilation, and the recent wave of abortion bills. Anti-racism activist and diversity trainer Jane Elliott described it as a fear so great that white people, including political leaders, will try to do anything to see that doesn't happen. Hyper-punitive abortion legislation recently passed in Alabama bans the procedure outright except in cases of risk to a woman's health. And in Georgia, a woman who obtains an abortion will spend the rest of her life in prison. Of 212 lawmakers in Alabama, the Georgia who votes ushered in the most restrictive abortion laws we've seen yet. 211 are white. What drives all of this is as philosophical as religion. It's not faith, it's not principle, it's the fear of genetic dominance of black and brown people. The late Francis Cress Helsing, psychiatrist and author of ISIS Papers, The Keys to the Colors and the Cress Theory of Color Confrontation and Racism, is known well for her theory of black and brown genetic dominance over the white recessive gene. Quote, people of color have the capacity to generally annihilate white people, she explained. And, okay, this is pretty terrible, jeez. In terms of the rhetoric of how violent, like, you're making their existence in the face of white people just sound. They're not even doing anything to you, they just exist. That's all this is. Anyways, unless white people control the reproduction of people of color, we can postulate that perhaps one day there won't be any white people. But Weisling was not the only one who held this belief. Her contemporary demographer Ben Wattenberg wrote in his book, The Birthrate, that the main problem in the United States is the low number of white births. Wattenberg believes that white people, without the change of course, would lose the numerical majority in the U.S. It would no longer be a white man's land. Now, to be fair, he was just pointing out this could have been what he preferred as well, but he was also pointing out just the fear and the overall trend in America. I would have to say there was a lot of racism when reading that book, but like the fact of demographic decline and just saying it in ways that he did seemed pretty like dog whistly sometimes. Alright. He proposed 3 ways to address this: pay women to have babies, increase the number of immigrants, and prevent abortion. The first 2, he wrote, aren't the answer because they would also increase the number of black and brown babies. But the first, he posited, would solve the birth dearth because 60% of abortions are performed by white women. So yeah, I bet you for the most part, conservatives blame white women for needing immigrants in our country, which is, and their country too as well, but obviously they don't see it that way. Anyways, the long-standing framework that once redefined a woman's reproductive rights as essentially her own prerogative is being zealously deconstructed to affect an increase of white births over time, not unlike the legal maneuverings that effectively made a person's property under American chattel slavery. These anti-abortion laws, to variable degrees, take ownership of women's reproductive rights, in essence forcibly breeding white women to produce at higher rates. White patriarchal control over the lives of women, but especially women of color, isn't new. However, since before the nation was formed, white people have controlled the lives and reproduction of people of color. Genocide of indigenous people and chattel slavery of Africans and their descendants. A precursor to the criminalization and mass incarceration of black and brown people are our most prominent examples. Under chattel slavery, African women and their daughters were bred as animals for purposes of economic dominance and financial benefits and dividends of which are still being realized today. In Unrediscovering Slave Breeding in 13th Amendment Jurisprudence, author and law professor Pamela Bridgewater described this as, quote, intricacies of a practice that consisted of sexual dominance and reproductive exploitation and designed specifically to facilitate economically and psychologically the institution of slavery. The war on drugs and tough on crime laws have also been made long-lasting and devastating impacts on black and brown communities. The long significant being the loss of reproductive rights, even as some forms of marijuana have now been legalized or decriminalized in most states. In most states. Many black and brown men and some women are incarcerated at higher rates than white people for the same offenses, and in some cases serve longer sentences. Sociologist James Olison suggests that the practice of eugenics didn't disappear after World War II, but has merely repackaged. Oh, yes, true. He writes in, quote, The New Eugenics, the black hyper-incarceration and human abatement, that imprisonment experts prolactic effect on reproduction, and because minorities are incarcerated in disproportionately high numbers, they are most dramatically affected. In fact, for black males, quote, the effect of hyperincarceration might just be so great as to depress overall reproductive rates, reproducing a de facto new eugenics. I never really thought of that, like just keeping somebody from reproducing. I kind of just thought people were sterilized sometimes. But if this is something we're like analyzing and picking out, I guess that makes sense. Alright. In Gerbert v. Hickman, a California district court held that incarceration of inmates encompasses and restricts a right to procreate. Jeez. That incarceration not only hinders but also extinguishes reproductive rights and may influence overall fertility rates. Birth rates across birth rates across demographics have shown, but the recent abortion bans favor a fearful white populace. The black economic oppression along the mass incarceration of mostly black men means black births are likely to continue to decline. Now, as women are under threat of death or life in prison, the bans could forcibly increase white births under the hope of generating an uptick in the national white demographic. Holy shit. So both people are being controlled and utilized by force. So this is the strings of the class on the strings of the people that are the product of our economy, because you're also the product if you're in prison, because you made money to somebody, right? So we're all being used in different ways, I guess. So this isn't necessarily even like something white women want to happen. They're not really asking for the white birth rate to come back, even though there are very much outspoken racist white women who are basically the tokens until their mouths are zipped up and put back somewhere. We're only headed back slowly and inching slowly into having human rights literally decay. So anyways, now as women are under threat of death or life in prison, the bans could forcibly increase births under the hope of... Okay, sorry, I read that already. Alright, moving on. That's pretty messed up. And this is exactly kind of what I feared writing this. So the reset is what I think is happening to all our rights, whether in the face of a war that we're going to happen in 10 years, or the actual fascist uprising that's going to happen in 10 years, or anything could honestly happen for why our rights are literally being stripped from us. And that's the reset I think is happening. This isn't a demographic scheme or a democratic scheme or anything like that. I know this is very problematic, and I honestly regret writing this just because of the Great Reset title. So, anyways, so I wrote this obviously before a lot of information was coming out, and I did not edit this. This is just where I left off. I don't really plan on editing it. I think it covers already what's happening. Anyways, I'll stop bitching. COVID was and still is bad, but excuses in the name of and general responses during COVID, IMO, were and still are worse. The top dog whistle was really amplified during these past years during the pandemic, such as the birth dearth, initially about white natalist births, but the birth rate is low nationwide, despite the species growing to 8 billion and counting. The worry is the lack of reproduction to keep up with programmed obsolescence and the myth of the demographics spreading its values under psychotic manifest destiny, as Ben Wattenberg actually uses that term. Those in power saw plague plus abortion and contraception together as economy declined because of lockdown and not enough workers. So Roe was first to go, and soon to be Griswold, unfortunately. The the book The Birthrate had a list of culture war issues and was coincidentally thousands of dollars once the Supreme Court Samuel Alito comment was leaked. This plays into environmental excuses of bigotry, which might accelerate two types of things. The population bomb, claiming the third world are the cause of creating scarcity equal to mass destruction, unless the white births kept up, despite the industrial society causing the most harm and terraforming, empty houses with nobody in them as wasted space where nature could be or a homeless person could live, and just general like electronics and stuff spreading out trees where nobody lives. It's just, our stuff just there. Like solar panels. I'm not docking solar panels. I'm just saying like there's a lot of equipment we just have like just spread around that has nothing to do with population. Okay, this plays into immigration control. All right. 2. Former Sierra Club, Redwood Protection, and some environmental rhetoric, such as tragedy of the commons, to police demographics eating food, like the poor, and why we lock the dumpsters, probably. But the opposite extreme is happening as always. The climate changing society know what it's doing by destroying the planet for profit, riling up eco-fascism as the world burns. This also plays into immigration control, although it also plays into what's happening at home and controlling the woman in your border. So to understand certain... Oh, sorry. Now, it's great to worry about the planet, endangered trees, these things being value-worthy, just like population decline on its face is true, and proper resource allocation from consumers. But these truths and values are immensely weaponized. It being stated isn't the issue, but why, for who, and what ends. So to understand certain discrimination, you have to see the state for what it is. A pre-planned program. I don't really have the political theory talking points, but my understanding of state theory comes from demographics. Our system is designed for continuous growth and their cosmic manifest destiny that is based on programmed obsolescence. This means beauty, the environment, material possessions. This is obvious. But obsolescence and keeping up with it requires constant babies, and naturally barriers prevent the status quo's fertility plan, and this society and across various others. So the barrier could be lots of things that demographers have a list of. Working women, abortion, contraceptive, gay people, intersex, and trans people who have actually been sterilized from society. Who might associate from trans culture is the Dr. Money situation, but it actually proves that dysphoria develops when you know your body isn't correct with how you feel inside. Now, dysphoria isn't always a trans thing, but it most definitely will occur if you try to rearrange somebody at an early age before they're even consciously aware of things. Alright, but mind you, this isn't a trans culture as a medical need, but actually ruining lives for a test by Dr. Money. Privilege benefits certain groups, obviously, but that doesn't mean privileged types don't suffer from the disparity society creates. Black and brown people may be less off, for instance, but this harms white people as well. The medical bills affect white people, the economy collapse affects white people, and yada yada. But we assume genocide... if we assume genocide isn't just dead bodies, but the ruining of lives until the social and national pattern is unraveled into ultimate despair, then everyone is being genocided by the state? Simple as that, right? Totally out of context, everything the same? No, not everything is the same. Discrimination is felt at different levels and times. Different groups are being killed at other magnitudes, and certainly for vastly different reasons. We can't generalize unless you're dishonest. Now, I'm pretty sure fentanyl isn't being laced by the CIA this time. It's most likely by cops. I think I've seen articles about that. Unfortunately, that's all that the information I got that. Anyways, the system does not violently target minorities or demographics necessarily anymore, at least not publicly, but things are vastly disproportionately placed due to past discrimination, solidified into stereotyped caste systems of assumed or colorblind bondage, piles of humans in prison. Any victim of a crappy environment committing a crime is essentially the one doing the act. So to deny that would be blind to physics. But it's more deranged not to see why people are angry, poor, depressed, not trusting of others, etc. The excuses for COVID to show America with its mask off took the faces of many terrible actions over the years, and stress being used for statistic terror ends by newscasters like Tucker Carlson. Him being fired, I don't even think that really did anything. Like he's working on some other show or something. He's still gonna have his fan base most likely because he's everywhere. You know, he's got his news channel on Facebook, Twitter, etc. He's probably a fan of Elon Musk at this point, even more so. He can buddy up with the goddamn Taliban for all I give a shit. Alright. Phase 1. Eugenic quarantine via Title 42 mirroring the 1942 measure at the Mexican border. Its good faith interpretation is for health and sanitizing, but demographers know Americans were iffy about immigration despite being a land of constant change and native removal as colonialism often does. But conservatives will often complain with talks of the browning of America. Trump Title 42 legacy is now being upheld by Biden as Abbott and others send migrants to random places out of spite, which is what the Democrats are being ironically blamed for, and what they call great replacement. What's happening at the Rio Grande right now is actually messed up. I will get to that soon. That actually will be separate immigration research, maybe. Okay. Phase 2, removing Roe and anti-abortion laws from 1800s. And reviving anti-abortion laws from 1800s. This actually harms minorities more, but overall, women were forced to have children no matter what. Even skull-less children or babies born dead, birthing it to knowingly bury it right after, in case the kid became a statistical worker. Yeah, they're just gonna knock on the fucking coffin, and they're gonna start working for some fucking douchebag millionaire schlub. Ugh. Okay. 3. The Birthrate talks about the elderly dragging society down. I don't know if this is necessarily the right's attack on the elderly, but in terms of neoliberalism and the selfishness of money, that I feel like the conservatives are all about the neoliberalism and than the money, so they most likely are okay with this, even though they're pro-family values. The elderly being an anachronism for big families from simpler times to help raise children, but now in the modern world there's a battle of balancing out elderly expenses in the working class, and not enough babies means potential later retirement for the workforce. There were twisted journalist talks of how COVID would vaguely benefit the economy if it was allowed to cull the elderly. I actually came across this subtle attitude when debating a nurse. She said COVID was not a threat, but I pressed her about the elderly, and she said a lot of old people did die. So the contradicting message of it wasn't a big deal, yet elderly people died. Okay, that's pretty disgusting. Even if it's true, that's merely a cold logic we could never unleash on innocent people. It would only turn into a sick eugenist dream. 4. The jilted apartheid stage of trans culture from hundreds of years of discrimination and knowledge burned by Nazis, especially minorities, those are gay trans individuals being considered transvestites, inverts, predators, decadence, decay causing, and gay or trans people in the past being compared to primitive or quote lower races from writers such as Kraft Ebing or Havelock Ellis. This rhetoric is returning in 2020s with euphemisms like groomer or talks of eradicating trans people. As mentioned, it's a fertility issue for the state to have straight white people procreate. The trans issue might well be lumped in with abortion and contraceptive removals, but to backpedal slightly, the current cultural war on LGBT is arbitrary, happening during COVID era, and that's why at most this version of discrimination was prefabricated during COVID era as an excuse to do so under the stress and statistic means by Tucker and podcasters like Tim Pool. On a vaguely positive note, the bad people I implied exist behind the scenes are few and far between, so there is hope, honestly. These people are not being very optically safe, and they are being openly fascist, so the public can see and not let it come through. Hopefully we have a chance to stop it, right? Anyways, America may be run by insane clowns, but it's a small number, like Nazi Germany was less than 40% of extremists when they took over. To sort of go over something I didn't delve into, extremism at its most socially acceptable is the disproportionately playing field we take advantage of. Example being policing impoverished areas that happen to be historically angry and possibly due to uh, systemic trauma that we haven't really allowed to generationally heal at all. And personally, most disturbing of all, disproportionate abortions and contraceptions to minorities. A hypocritical realization of this controlled fertility came from a man named Dick Gregory in Chicago, who acknowledged, quote, "For years they told us where to sit, where to eat, where to live. Now they want to dictate our bedroom habits. First, a white man tells me where to sit in the back of the bus. Now it looks like he wants me to sleep under the bed. Back in the days of slavery, black folks couldn't grow kids fast enough for white folks to harvest. Now that we've had a little taste of power, white folks want us to call a moratorium on having children." Um, End quote. When we wanted them for our industry, we praised them as important objects, but once we no longer needed open minorities doing slave work, we pretend that all the kids are their fault. The myth of racial fecundity to scapegoat the old product is obsolete, and the plan to engineer their numbers, but again, not targeted eventually, but disproportionate placement to have kids and thus a reason to get rid of them. Overall, this mistake happens, and she has the right to do it on an individual level. Minorities and white folks in poverty experienced this, but only black people got the quote Negro Project Planned Parenthood in history due to potential generational servitude that people think characterized the behaviors and attitudes of African Americans. Infant mortality was a deep problem for them, but it was created by colonialism for the most part, and even that's hypocritical for the West to cast the children as waste to the system after past exploitation. And even though it's hypocritical, there were many black figures such as Webb Du Bois and Martin Luther King who agreed Planned Parenthood would spare the suffering of the new generation. And again, this is why just choice on an individual level, not targeting people on welfare, is a little better. Anyways, the far-right conspiracy about the politicians' COVID safety guidelines into calling it Great Reset is everything the right advocate for, oddly enough, but pretends is a lefty takeover. The removal of immigration as usual, but an excuse to, women's bodily autonomy attack to engineer the population for the economy, plans to abandon the elderly, gay and trans rights under constant scrutiny, book bans to burning in Tennessee. All this happens while Tucker Carlson's legacy Americans make it all about themselves, unable to handle a crisis as they become anti-vax, anti-mask, and the lockdowns that made sense for safety, but the economy couldn't care less about anyone. The true reset is the right's conspiracy for everything to be woke, which honestly is just a dog whistle for media with nuanced outlooks or minorities in it. Everything our country stood for in brief moments of peace when the Cold War ended in the 90s and minor asylum victories student protests from the 60s to the 80s. Kids were told people came to America for a good life. Immigration is implied. And there's lots of old statements you can make about how we praised immigrants and how America is just based on immigration. But it might have been, I don't know, maybe they were coping, but it was still the best move in terms of keeping the America afloat. Anyways, now it's official that America, at least from their perspective, is not the place for that, leaving the huddled masses in the rain. There's a prefabricated war within the liberal framework where Democrats and Republicans in power agree with the bottom line of the capital via the population, or they are being used as useful idiots by the people who want the great population, and not everyone's thinking in terms of population, so there are layers to this, and I think the politicians are almost it's hard to explain what I'm trying to say. I'll come back I'll come back to you on that. All right. So, so demographic manipulation isn't out of the question for these people. Democrats like President Clinton saying keep it rare, referring to abortion, Nancy Pelosi in 2017 telling some of the voter base to stop focusing on abortion, and Hillary Clinton saying Dems shouldn't make transgender stuff a priority. These people are not on your side. They won't stay harm reductive for long. And I've been saying this for a while because as much as there's this optics of who looks a little different, there really isn't that much of a difference. It just, but just because the Democrats don't get anything done, just because they don't do anything, does not mean you vote for Republicans. Like, not voting is also a problem. Third party is basically useless. Um, I think this is like a God of the Gaps argument because we are in such a like a tight spot right now and politically where the public can't really make change, and not serious change, not how it wants, not like on the level of Bernie Sanders, which even Trump supporters were like, we're never getting, Trump supporters were all for Bernie Sanders, but we're never getting anyone like Bernie Sanders again. They're not letting that happen. It was a mistake for them. That was when their freedom would have literally been taken from their hands. Or sorry, that was when their